Good afternoon, good morning, maybe as far as good evening to all of you. Thank you for being here. I was a little bit delayed jumping on because I was dropping a note to one of our attendees that my first job was at the Mystic Seaport making lemonade in a very large and hot hoop skirt many years ago. So great to see such diversity, both in terms of where people are coming from institutionally, but also geographically. So thank you for choosing to be part of with us. It's really my pleasure to facilitate this panel and really learn from our panelists. My name is Kimberly Cornett. I run the impact investing practice at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. We have a $200 million allocation that we're in the process of investing in the community development finance system and against specific programmatic priorities, making debt, equity, investments, and guarantees. But the stars of our show today are our panelists, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Una Ocelli from the Lilly School of Philanthropy at Indiana University. Dr. Ocelli has really authored so many important pieces of research around philanthropy and social impact. It's worth reading her bio in detail. Notably for me, she is the founder of Generosity for Life, which is a tool that philanthropists and other social impact investors can use to measure their impact. That is certainly something that we struggle with in my day-to-day work every day, so eager to hear more about that. She's also on the board of CARE, certainly one of the most powerful NGOs across the globe. Eric Clemens, most importantly, is the proud father of 4 beautiful daughters who we were just hearing about, educated young women in their own right. He is the CEO of the Connecticut Center for Arts and Philanthropy, working to use arts education on behalf of at-risk young people. Eric and I share the honor of chairing the housing authorities in our hometown, which are complicated, but often very essential kind of housing intermediaries. So I was pleased to find that connection. And Karen Yanis is the former president of Crown Family Philanthropies, but perhaps most interestingly, and I would love to ask you 10,000 questions, was Oprah Winfrey's right-hand person in establishing her philanthropies most domestically and internationally, so has seen a whole ton of interesting work on behalf of a very powerful female philanthropist. So Karen, I'm eager to hear your stories. And Karen and Una share a common connection via their affiliation at Indiana University. So we have a lot to learn from these 3 exceptional leaders, and Una is going to lead us off with a little bit of kind of shaping for the conversation that's to come.
Thank you so much, Kimberly, and thank you to all of you who joined us this morning, afternoon, and evening. It's such a pleasure to see so many participants from all over the world, and I am just delighted to be part of this panel. I'm also going to do a bit of a broad stroke sharing of where we are currently in philanthropy. All of you will agree that we are living in unprecedented times. It's very difficult to predict what is going to happen over the next few months, but what we do have that can provide a bit of a guiding light and some insights as we move along the uncertainties that we face is the new data that is in the philanthropic sector. At the Lilly Family School, we've coined a new word, philanthrometrics. It is philanthropy, as you know, means the love of mankind, and the notion of metrics, measurement, a newer concept in the English language dating back to the 1800s. When we bring these 2 things together, the heart, the love of mankind, the love of humanity, along with the impact, the measurement, and the desire to actually see how philanthropy is changing during this time, we have a set of powerful tools that can guide our work. So with that, I'd like to share some of the data that our team has been collecting during this pandemic. It certainly has been inspiring to see the generosity across the board that so many Americans, but also people around the globe have been engaged with. Today, I'll share some of that data and then offer some next steps, call to action for the philanthropic sector. So let's get started. We practiced this sharing our screen, so I think I am in good shape to do that. I hope everyone can see the screen. Yes? Perfect. Now, I think everyone will agree that there has been a lot of, certainly a lot of transformation taking place, not just in philanthropy, but in almost every area of our lives since the pandemic. The very first insight that the data provides is that the donor landscape itself is changing. Just before or during the pandemic, we had the opportunity to release for the very first time in a virtual format Giving USA. From Giving USA, we know that heading into the pandemic, so this is 2019 data, philanthropy reached a record level in the United States of $450 billion. The bulk of those dollars come from individuals. And one message that we have taken forward from these data is the role of individuals. In these very challenging times, we're really seeing individuals at all income levels, not just major donors, but also donors across the income spectrum really step up. We've also seen foundations at the community level, but also at the national and regional level play a major role in responding to crises. Foundations have relaxed some of their funding regulations and rules, changed their practices, and introduced more flexibility around their relationships with grantees. We've also seen corporations take a much more visible role in meeting needs at the community level, and charitable bequests continue to play a role even during the pandemic. So this overall picture, $450 billion, individual giving is still the largest slice and reminds all of us about the power of individuals to transform communities and ultimately to change the world. When people think about philanthropy, they tend to focus on the corporate and foundation dollars. But if we were to add up the individual segment, half of the foundation sector and the charitable bequests, we would have something like 88 to 89% of all giving coming from individuals if we include the smaller family foundations. And this gets us to the very next finding, which is, are we at an inflection point in philanthropy? The changes we've seen in COVID-19 have ushered in a new era of thinking. As we've noted, philanthropists at all levels are willing to rethink their approaches and consider perhaps solutions that were never considered before. We're also seeing, as we unpack the data, that in the past, and this is certainly consistent with other data from disaster giving, when we look at the number of funders that have been engaged in large gifts, corporate giving programs and corporate foundations make up almost half of that. So we've seen corporations really elevate this notion of profits with purpose. In some ways, this is a move that has been taking place for some time, where corporations are increasingly raising their voices to speak out on social and justice-related issues, but that has been accelerated during the pandemic. We've also seen community foundations as well as independent and operating foundations play a role in terms of the dollars that are being contributed. And for those of you who are interested in a deeper dive into the data, one of my colleagues at the Lilly Family School has an initiative that actually tracks the community foundation dollars at the community level. There's a lot to learn. So far from that data, more than $1 billion has flowed through community foundations. A lot of those dollars have gone out the door to support food insecurity, mental health, and many other basic needs. So we've seen philanthropy show agility and flexibility in the face of a very challenging environment. And of course, the challenge is for some of that work to continue because the health and economic crisis is still very much unfolding. Last year, 2020, we certainly dealt with a series of health and economic shocks, not just in the United States, but around the world. In addition to the COVID pandemic, we have also been here in the US, and you could say around the world, engaged in a national reckoning on racial equity and social justice. the killing of George Floyd and many other African Americans has led to a surge in donations to causes at the front line of racial and social justice. Of course, the question is really how long and sustained this interest will be, but already we're seeing major philanthropists, but also everyday Americans increase their giving to combat racial inequality. The last finding is one that's going to be very interesting to this audience. As we've seen in many other fields, technology is disrupting philanthropy, and we've seen that pace accelerate during the pandemic. Just to anchor our discussion, going into the pandemic, less than 10% of giving was taking place online. We've seen that trend accelerate with many more donors giving online, events being moved to virtual fundraising events, and a number of new initiatives taking place. Even traditional charities are moving to bring in crowdfunding into their work. One very prominent example is the CDC Foundation. They have raised more than $50 million online crowdfunding using a platform called charity.com. We expect that going forward, more organizations are going to include crowdfunding in their work, and more giving is going to take place online. With this as an overview, I'd like to issue a call to action to all of you on joining today. Number one, innovation. We've seen philanthropy innovate and show flexibility and agility during this crisis. The second is collaboration. Undergirding all of this work, especially at the community level, we've seen funders really come together to work jointly on racial equity, on social justice, but also on meeting the health and economic needs of communities. And finally, we've seen philanthropy lift up issues of equity and inclusion in a way that has not happened in the past. And this is an important moment for all of us to continue this work, not just during the pandemic, but even going forward to not just, as we keep hearing, rebuild, but build back better and build back with racial equity at the center. So with this, I'll stop sharing and I'll turn this back over to our moderator.
Una, thanks for that. And it is powerful to see those numbers in aggregate in terms of the culture of generosity that we really have here in America, which is quite unique. I think a question that I had for you before we turn it over to Eric is I'm on the board of Habitat for Humanity International. We raise a lot of money from individuals, and we're talking a lot about the generational shift between younger donors and older donors. You talked about kind of the increasing prevalence of technology, you know, as a medium to raise money. How do you think about, or what does your data tell you about kind of the generational differences between younger donors and older donors?
That's a very important point. When we look at the data from the Philanthropy Panel study, we have tracked giving over the past 2 decades. And for the first part of the 21st century, giving was stable. 2/3 of Americans gave, and this had not changed very much. Beginning with the Great Recession, that share has started to decline, and now we have 55% of Americans giving prior to the pandemic. A lot of those who do not give, who are not giving or who have stopped giving, are younger donors, as well as donors with lower incomes and less education. So that may be another call to action on this panel, is how do we engage a new generation of donors, not just the millennials, we hear a lot about them, but also Generation Zs as well. And giving has grown over time, but has stayed at about 2% of overall GDP. And in order to really boost giving going forward, we will need to bring the next generation along. It's encouraging during the pandemic because we have seen younger donors really step up, not just with their financial resources, but also their time, their talent, and their testimony, posting on social media and active in the social and racial justice movements of our time. So I think it's encouraging, but nonprofits of all different sizes will have to prioritize engagement with younger donors and be willing to look at different models. Crowdfunding is one that definitely appeals to younger donors.
Well, Eric, you are a man who spends a lot of time with young people. So with that, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Kimberly. First, one quick correction. I am the CEO and president of the Connecticut Center for Arts and Technology, not yet Philanthropy. But I feel very honored, one, to be here with you all, especially Karen and Una and you, Kimberly. Una, I am very proud that I am the first to respond to your call to action. So what I want to do is really hopefully provoke some thought to this group who is on this call and others in this country around philanthropy. One thing that you said, Una, which is really important to me, as I think deeply about philanthropy, is this idea that philanthropy means the love of mankind. And it is my belief that if in fact you love someone, then you should know them. And so the elephant in the room for me is really how philanthropy is working in my local area for the most part. I can't talk about it nationally. Now, what comes to mind is the fact that there's an echo, is the fact that what I'm seeing empirically as a grantee is there is no connection, there is no relationship, and there is no kinship from philanthropists to those who are in need in community. And I think in some way it is immoral that folks who are not connected, who have no kinship, who have no relationship to the suffering and needs of the people, yet they have authority to say yes, no, and or how much folks who are in deep need can get or cannot have. And I think there needs to be an address to that. I think there's a lack of morality as it relates to the full meaning of philanthropy. And I think it is an elephant in the room. And most often, those who are in philanthropy don't even look like the people who are in need. And I don't think this is discussed enough. I don't think it's discussed enough privately, definitely not openly. And so I was thinking, very much like, I'm a trustee at Yale New Haven Hospital. Very much the hospital is now deploying community health workers to go into community to address and understand the social determinants of health. I believe there should be a deployment of philanthropists or folks who work in philanthropic institutions to go into communities of need, to understand the social determinants of need, thereby cultivating a relationship with the folks who are in need. Their giving would be different, and quite frankly, they would learn more about themselves as philanthropists, more so than folks who are in need learn about philanthropists. And so for me, these are things that I believe should inspire Black philanthropy. I don't think there are enough Black philanthropists or Black philanthropic institutions that understand intimately the issues of Black communities and quite frankly of poverty. And so these are some of the issues that I want to lift up on this Zoom and hopefully have a very robust conversation and courageous conversation around these things, because for me, far too long, and I have great relationships. I'll be very open with you. I have great relationships with folks who fund my organization and the endeavors that I look to achieve. But the difference with those folks are they sit with me, they talk with me, they ask me questions because they know in a deep way, in a very courageous way, in a very open way, that they won't have a relationship with the communities I serve, but they can have a relationship with me as I serve them. And so I think this idea of relationship, authentic relationship between community and philanthropy is really, really needed. And we really, really have to do something about that. If in fact we are really addressing racial issues and social injustice and all these things, it takes relationship. It takes the full meaning and deep meaning of the word philanthropy. You cannot love people if you don't know them. And so I want to have a provocative and hopefully a robust conversation about that. I will yield my time, Kimberly.
Well, that's not going to be the last that we're going to talk about that subject, because the chat is going wild with validation of the really important points that you just made. And I will say that, Eric, you and I have a shared experience, you know, on a housing authority, and my time with the housing authority is probably the best development I get as a person and as a professional, because, you know, we spend, you know, many hours a month trying to figure out not the big lofty questions that I think about at work, but how are we going to make sure that the plumbing works during the winter? You know, it is meat and potatoes issues that are at the center of people's lives. And and I think many of us, particularly those of us, you know, who work in national philanthropies, you know, we are a very long way from the ground, and you have to be really intentional about creating those experiences. I did note that Dana Becerra from the Heron Foundation is with us and in the chat, and I would invite Dana at some point. Heron has really pioneered a new way of working, as I understand it, with a local investment committee in the Buffalo area. Many of us are watching that to try to figure out, you know, what works and how we model that. But I think just one example of trying to kind of get to ground. I think Eric, you said, or somebody in the chat, you know, you can't love somebody you don't know, and I really do appreciate that. We're going to move to Karen and hear kind of from her perspective as somebody who has been a leader and advisor of people who are dispersing very significant resources, kind of her vantage point on this.
And now I have a boutique advising firm, and I advise wealth management groups, and I advise ultra high net worth families and work with businesses. And the role of advisors, whether you're a philanthropic advisor or an advisor through wealth management, is to be a liaison, right? And in the philanthropic space, it's to be the liaison between resource and need. And I dropped off, Eric, and didn't know if you had mentioned Brian Stevenson's Just Mercy in your conversation, but I think that what Brian Stevenson does in Just Mercy is he talks about the importance of being proximate. And if you're acting as the liaison between resource and need, it's up to you to be proximate to what's happening on the ground. Now, there's a huge power imbalance in philanthropy, and you referenced that power imbalance. And a big part of what's happening now, this goes back to some of what Una had said about the transitions that are happening in philanthropy currently, that I think are so powerful, is that there's this whole concept of trust philanthropy, and people who've been giving in areas for a long time are trying to find out more about what's happening, what the immediate needs of their organizations and the issues that they support are. So there's this group called the Trust Philanthropy Project, and they outline these 6 issues that relate to trust philanthropy. And one is giving multi-year grants, right? So making longer term bets, streamlining paperwork so you're not demanding quite as much. But the really interesting one from my perspective is to have the funder create the relationship and not look to the grantee to build a relationship, but for the funder to really work on interacting with that organization, understanding what their needs are, and starting to break down that imbalance of power, because that imbalance of power doesn't do anybody any good. Right? Many of us who have traveled extensively in the developing world have seen projects that have been top down. Like the landscape is littered with clinics that are empty. They don't have healthcare workers. They don't have pharmaceuticals. They're not even doing palliative care, or huge projects of solar panels that have been funded by someone that were never actually hooked up because all of those dots weren't connected early on. And the damage that's done by that is not to the funder failing. It's to the community that's being served having their resilience damaged, their trust damaged. And that could have been, those issues could have been dealt with really easily on the front end by engaging people from those communities about what they need, what resources exist. And frankly, having a project like that fail damages the funders as well, because they no longer want to go into those spaces because they don't think that they're realistic. The other thing that we're seeing a lot now is this immediate need. I mean, all of us are seeing people online for food depositories who are opera singers, who are the people who work in our communities. They're people who thought that they had a safety net and no longer feel that that safety net is there for them, and they're food insecure or housing insecure. So how do we think about those folks, right? And what it is that we need to do for people who we've known and are part of the fabric of communities that we live in, who are now suffering. What's our responsibility? And that's one of the reasons why I love the title of this panel, just roles and responsibilities in philanthropy. And I have a lot more to say, but I'll stop there.
I was toggling over. Lisa was kind enough to put the 6 principles in the chat, and I thought I would take a look. So sorry for the delay. I think that this issue of trust and agency in communities is, so vitally important. Karen, I mean, I think a question is, you've advised some pretty extraordinary individuals and families. What is the starting place that you engage them on that point? If somebody has a vision of, putting a solar array in a community, how do you kind of expand their thinking so that they understand and value that community engagement and the other necessary pieces of infrastructure that have to go along with that particular project?
Yeah. Does anybody remember Stephen Covey's book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People? Like, his first habit is be proactive, but the second one is one that stayed with me, and that's begin with the end in mind. What is it that you want to accomplish, and where is it going to, where's it going to take you? There's a lot of risk involved. So helping people understand the landscape and see the risks that are out there and make calculated bets on what they can do. I mean, taking risks is really important, but doing it in an informed way makes a huge difference. So just staying true to mission and being able to be nimble is one of the things that's really important. But when I work with ultra high net worth clients, families, I do a lot of training and provide them with information from the Lilly Family Schools and Giving USA and all kinds of resources in ways that they can easily digest, and also open up the conversation with peers, other people who are working, and introduce them to people who are working in the field. Now, I have one client who's doing a lot of work in the youth and mental health and homeless space. And we had a conversation with someone from an organization, who looked like he'd been doing this for a while, could have gone to Yale, could have gone to Harvard. And halfway through the conversation, he said, and I spent years of my childhood living under a bridge. And all of a sudden, everyone at the table kind of sat back a little bit and sat with the fact that here's someone who has made it through these incredibly challenging times, who's advising others. And it's just so important to acknowledge that, and let that wash over us, so that we're there hearing firsthand from someone who's had those experiences and who's been able to create a solution.
Back to Eric in a second, but did just kind of want to lift up, because one of the Trust Philanthropy's principles is around kind of, you mentioned multi-year grants, and want to state the obvious in that, the very large gifts that Mackenzie Scott has just made were really unrestricted operating support. And I think that was such a wonderful list right before Christmas to see. But, concurrent to our panel is a panel on enterprise level capital. And that kind of significant support, unrestricted support, can be transformative for an organization. And I mean, I think many of us have seen, very discrete and very restrictive project support that really doesn't build the enterprise. I thought that was a really tremendous example of how to do it right. Eric, can you talk from your perspective about some advice that you would give philanthropists in terms of good ways to make that connection with communities, strategies that you've seen work, strategies that you would like us to employ?
Yeah, great question. Great questions. One, I think understanding and believing in the data points from very much what Karen said, lived experiences, right? The grandmother who lives in community, who has raised 3 generations of children. Those are her stories, are great data points in terms of what is needed, what has happened, the history of a community. And it's not even just about suffering, Kimberly. It is about also the beauty of community and what's possible in community. I think, you know, what I was able to do, I co-published with the Community Foundation for Greater New Haven here and Data Haven, a guy named Mark Abraham, who I think is in the audience. We co-published with management teams in Dixwell community and Newhallville community, 2 probably the most depressed neighborhoods in New Haven. And we got together and we published a community index looking at hard data, very much what Una presented to us earlier. Hard data on these 2 neighborhoods as it relates to jobs, education, you know, the lack of economic infrastructure, the lack of capital formation. And I wanted to do that because whatever I implemented in these communities, I wanted to be like deeply thoughtful, right? That I was hitting the marks, because I feel like far too long throughout the history of philanthropy, philanthropists and philanthropic institutions have addressed or given money to organizations, and those organizations have really allowed people who live in poverty to be comfortable in poverty. I want to alleviate poverty. And so really understanding the nuances and complexities of community in those communities that you look to help, and understanding the people and what they've gone through and what they hope for, right? You know, poverty is the issue, but we seem to want to address the manifestations of poverty as opposed to poverty itself. And so really getting to Una's credit, really getting hard data on what these communities are experiencing, and then addressing those data points with also coveting and honoring the stories of community that are just as vital as the hard data points.
Can you talk a little bit about measurement? You know, particularly kind of the balance of qualitative data and stories and kind of the hard science of what is working, and how the methodologies that you have seen tried to kind of balance the 2 and then spit out a better way of working?
Absolutely. I was actually going to jump in with that very point. Philanthrometrics has, you know, love of mankind as its core, but also the notion of metrics and measurement. And when we say measurement, of course, people think about hard numbers, quantitative data. I'm an economist. I love data. I love numbers. But underneath those numbers are people. And I think understanding what goes behind the numbers, and that's where the qualitative data comes in. Increasingly, we've seen funders use both. So I am a big fan of collect the data, but also collect the qualitative stories, bring the data to life. And what we've noted over and over again is those stories can inspire, can move people to action, and can also be part of learning. One thing that funders are doing today, which I am so excited about, is that they're sharing what's working. So this idea of data is for the work that they're doing, but also for the funders. This is a time of incredible change, but also a lot of learning, hopefully, and listening. And so for funders to be able to develop not just the data, but also that qualitative element, and to be very intentional and thoughtful about it. So whether those are case studies, stories, interviews, key lessons learned, but having a think of this as a toolbox, a toolkit. You're going to need the qualitative, you're going to need the hard data as well, the quantitative. So I think this is a time when we're learning that complexity is part of our world, and to really transform communities and to move the needle on the types of issues, whether it's poverty, criminal justice, the environment, we're going to need to marshal our entire toolkit. And that's going to include sort of this deep qualitative work. So although I really value the hard numbers, that's probably my own love, I have also, my mother's a historian, so I love learning about how did we get here? And I think for funders to really understand issues, they're going to have to go into this sort of deep learning, deep listening mode.
Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, you know, the Field Foundation here in Chicago has done some heat maps of Chicago. And when we talk about social determinants of health, they've actually, and you can look on their website, they've got this data, and it's really fascinating to see between zip codes what the social determinants of health are, what the, you know, and just comparing one community to another based on the zip code, what the, you know, there are zip codes in Chicago where 50% of the people have been incarcerated or have relatives who have been incarcerated. And that's not something that you can find in a lot of other communities in Chicago. And there's a 30-year lifespan difference based on what zip code you live in. And that kind of data is really critical to helping people understand what's happening and how we need to really engage more deeply in community.
This is really a question for the group. You know, before I came to RWJ last year, I was with the Kresge Foundation, and we did a good job at measuring data. RWJ, I think, takes it to the next level. But where, you know, measuring, investing in data is not very sexy. So I wonder kind of what strategies or advice you would have. We probably have some philanthropists in the audience. What advice do you give folks in terms of making sure that they're not just investing in the solution, but investing in kind of the measurement, you know, that helps to tell that story over time, informs others? What's the standard of practice?
Oh, I'll take that out. And you know, I'm not, Karen and Onasim, they're super data people. I'm not a super data people, but I do use data. But I think the greatest data I have been experiencing is if someone, a funder, a philanthropist, a philanthropic institution gives you funds for a specific reason, then you should do the very thing that you say you are going to do with those funds. I believe that funders fund people, they don't fund products or programs. And the fact that you're credible, you have character, and you are true to your word that the money that is given to you, you are doing exactly what you said you were going to do. To me, that is the greatest data point of all. So that's really important. And it's important to those who are on this Zoom that I repeat, who are grantees or trying to, you know, raise funds, that funders, in my opinion, Karen and one of you guys are way well versed than I am, but it's been my experience that personal relationships are really, really important, and that funders give to people more so than they give to programs or projects. But you have to do what you say you're going to do with what you are given.
So I'm gonna,
you know, can I jump in?
Go ahead.
Eric, you know, you make such a good point. Money is inanimate, right? It doesn't create change by itself. It really needs those relationships in advance. And there are a set of assumptions in the field that we just kind of take for granted. Like there's a finite, organizations feel like there's a finite amount of money out there, and that people who are working in the same space need to compete for that money. But when you think about the funding that's available through wealth management organizations and the private equity that sits on the sidelines and the availability of impact capital to create change, that assumption needs to go away. And our behavior in the sector, you know, even calling ourselves nonprofits is a negative, where I heard someone the other day talk about the juxtaposition between for-profits and for-purpose organizations. And I love the term for-purpose organization. I also just want to tell a couple of really quick stories about the other side and dealing with people who need to have immediate relief right now. I love, Eric, your focus on the elimination of poverty. But a couple of years ago, I watched a YouTube by this guy named Sasha Dichter, who works for the Acumen Fund, and they spend all their time thinking about ways to create social businesses and use patient capital in order to develop solutions in communities all over the world. And Sasha said in this YouTube that he was walking home and he'd see all these homeless people and people were asking him for money all the time. So he made a deal with himself. He called it the Generosity Project. And every time someone asked him for something, he would give it to them. And he said he did that for a month and then the YouTube finished. So I called him and I said, what happened? And he said, I felt better. And he said, I don't have any data on this, but I felt better. And the other day I was walking into a CVS and there was a guy who was sitting on a corner and he said, I don't want money, I just want food. And I walked into the CVS and I looked around and I walked back out and I said, what would you like? And he said, I don't have any teeth and I need something soft. And I thought, wow, there's this ability to generate dignity just by asking someone a question, right? It doesn't have to be about money. So it directed me in what I was able to go into the pharmacy and get for him because I knew what he needed. But then I came home and started thinking about how do I continue to fund the organizations that are providing dental care and transitional housing and supportive housing for someone like this, right? And how can he use what he has to inform others?
I would also just piggyback and say that I was taught a number of years ago, there's also a lot of dignity in asking somebody's name and be very specific about who they are as an individual.
And just saying hello.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think hello is the most profound thing you could say.
Mm-hmm. So we've talked a lot about proximity and really kind of getting to ground. This has been such a challenging year because the needs are so pronounced, at so many levels. I mean, Una, you made the point about, folks working in the theatrical industry, many of those people, suffering very deeply. How do you think about philanthropy's obligation to move very quickly in response to crisis needs like we've seen in 2020, and yet holding kind of the opportunity that we have, many of us who work for endowed foundations, that we can work on very long-term and systemic issues that may not in any one day show really any relevance or alleviation of that immediate suffering? How do you hold kind of both of those things well?
I think this is a time to really think beyond the frameworks we've worked with in the past. And that means doing this idea of quick response. One very prominent example is when schools shut down, many funders, many individual donors, foundations, and corporations worked immediately to get laptops to children around this country and even globally, and access to the internet. That was an immediate need, and philanthropy was able to fill in the gaps. But where we've also seen philanthropy work, and I think this is back to this idea of long-term, is issues around vaccine research and education and development, building health systems. Those are really long-term initiatives. Racial justice and equity, those are also very long-term issues. And one way for philanthropists, donors, funders to think about this is that we are going to have disasters, shocks, economic crises. Donors, we've seen that with 2017, Hurricane Harvey. Many funders started to allocate disaster budgets. And so that allows them to have a budget to respond to crises. We've also seen many donors start to set those kinds of accounts up for their own personal philanthropy while addressing those longer term needs, understanding that these crises will come up. We're starting to see more of them, not fewer of them. And that gives you the ability to respond to these urgent and immediate demands, and at the same time, invest in long-term building, recovery, and resilience.
Karen, Eric, anything to add on that point?
Yeah, I think so. What we did when COVID, around March or April of last year, we launched a COVID relief fund. And I worked with the Housing Authority here in New Haven to get $300 debit cards to families in high need in New Hallville and Dixwell areas. I was able to raise about $600,000 in 2 weeks because, again, very generous, thoughtful people who I was in relationship with. And so we were able to help about 750 families, but also we were able to reroute the food distribution of a local market downtown because, as you know, a lot of food was just sitting around going to waste because there were no restaurants open. And so we were able to reroute that food and set up our, I was telling Una and Karen earlier, we have a culinary school. And we have a social enterprise, which is a 40-seat restaurant where I am. And we set up the restaurant because it was closed and it became an ad hoc food distribution center. And so the community would come, we would bag the food up, and then we would send the food out, and there would be food lines daily. And so that food was going to folks. And then after a while, you know, we started thinking about the longer game. And I raised more money and set up an economic justice fund for Black entrepreneurs, Black businesses here in New Haven, because as you know, 45% of Black businesses throughout the country were closed, were shutting down. And so we wanted to do something about that. So I was able to raise money. I raised $200,000, got a $200,000 match from NHIC here in New Haven. So now we have $400,000 that will be going to Black businesses, Black entrepreneurs in New Haven. Doing this, to your question, Karen, doing this while at the same time, we have a huge $200 million project going on. We're building a place that will create economic infrastructure, capital formation, jobs in this neighborhood. And so we've master planned 8 acres. We have programmed that 8 acres and have now acquired the properties within this plaza, this strip mall that was a kind of urban renewal 1965 strip mall. And we acquired 80% of the properties, and we'll be raising that and building 160 units of housing, 15 food hall restaurants, a 350-seat performing arts center, a grocery store, retail spaces, a museum, and a banquet hall, and all of these things we are bringing to the community. So we're playing the long game while at the same time addressing the short game and the immediate needs of community. But it takes, again, relationships to do that.
So we have
Make no small plans. Make no small plans.
That's right.
And don't be victim to small dreams. So we have about 7 minutes left. There's a number of questions in the chat, several really relating to philanthropy's history in terms of the role that wealth has played in creating, tremendous inequalities in our society, and the role that philanthropy needs to play both in funding and in leadership in terms of creating kind of a just and equitable society. I wonder if each of you kind of have a thought about that, and maybe particularly from the unique seats that you're sitting in, how those that reality and that challenge is kind of showing up in your day-to-day work. Una, do you want to start?
I can start. I think this is a really important question. I'm so glad to see so many people raising it. And one of the areas that we've been working in over the last few months is really looking at these racial equity funds that are being set up around the country. Of the top 50 cities in the US, I'd say probably 70–80% of them have a racial equity fund. These are collaborative funds where funders are coming together to address core issues around workforce development, criminal justice. So I think philanthropy is at a time where it's really reckoning, not just with the challenges of our time, but also the structural inequalities of our time. I think it's very encouraging, but there's also an opportunity for deep learning and listening. I'm so glad that all the panelists have raised this for funders and donors of all different income levels to really take this time to understand the problems they're working on, gather the data, gather the qualitative, and bring those communities as partners, as collaborators to build the types of systems that we need that are sustainable and just. And this moment is really unprecedented, and it gives us a chance to all kind of reimagine. We don't have to go back to what we did before. We can be bold, we can work differently, and I am encouraged. I'm actually quite optimistic, especially when I see those collaborative funds that are developing across the country. It's not just one funder, it's many funders of all different types. And I think holding those funders accountable is going to be part of our work collectively.
May Rodriguez asked about organizing funders together. So ultra high net worth funders, people with significant resources, how do they know what each other are doing? And there is an organizational structure in philanthropy. So there are groups like the National Center for Family Philanthropy. There are a whole set of affinity groups. So if someone really cares about education or arts education or the environment, there are groups of people who are doing research and studying that they can go to. One of the most important things I would suggest for people who are on this call is to think about philanthropy as a discipline that can cross horizontally over whatever it is you're doing. Because understanding the field of philanthropy and how things work will allow you to think differently about fundraising and resource generation, but also about what's happening in the field. How things work, understanding who's giving what, and there's some great information, certainly through the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy at IU. The Chronicle on Philanthropy puts out great information and great data, but there's a ton in the field. Lastly, I just want to say we are at this amazing inflection point right now where I think everything is changing, in part because we have a sense of an existential crisis, right? This isn't just a storm that hit one part of the country. This is a storm that hit the whole world. And we're also dealing with environmental issues that are changing the way people live and what our livelihoods are looking like. So this is a time when people are thinking about using all of their resources. I think that the whole sector is going to change in large part because of all of the people who have access to, to thinking about it and working in it and thinking about public policy issues related to philanthropy.
I'm going to let Eric close us out here on this particular topic. I'm just putting in the chat, though, a report that a friend of mine, Cheryl Dorsey, was involved in writing around racial equity and funding disparities, around the disparities about who gets funding. And I do think that this is a transparency issue, that philanthropy really needs to not just wrestle with, but resolve. And Eric, to your point about proximity from my own little corner of the world, I think it is a real challenge in which we be very intentional about, taking the water out of the moat that is often around philanthropy. And, to your point, it's not just dollars, it's people. And so I think personally, I have to be very intentional about making sure that, there's no water in my moat, and that's not perfected yet, and that my networks are big, so that lots of different kinds of folks and not just people in my professional network have the opportunity to kind of tell us what they need. So I'm going to let you close us out on this. Yeah,
I appreciate the question, and I think there's an acute focus on wealth and how folks have created wealth or where they got their wealth from, but there is not enough conversation around power, and that's the conversation to me. Right, because social justice to me is one's ability to have enough, not one's ability to be wealthy. In order to have enough, there has to be a sharing of power, right? And so it is a power with dynamic, not a power over. And so I think we need to think about philanthropy in terms of power, and philanthropy being in a circle with community as opposed to looking down or being above community. And so to the extent that we can have a real conversation about the sharing of power, such that people have enough, I think that's where the conversation is. Not so much about wealth and where folks got their wealth, right? Because you have people who stormed the Capitol, right? Because they, so for whatever reason, they were empowered to do so, and they weren't wealthy. And so that's how we have to really think about this. The acquisition and sharing of power, and that philanthropy should be in a circle with community as opposed to on top of community.
So I want to thank my panelists. I feel like I got lucky in terms of the roster here. Thank all of you for joining. I want to there was so much great content. I wrote down a couple of things maybe to just summarize and leave with all of you. I think the concepts around proximity and power were really underscored, both from the panelists and from the chat. Using data and stories, using the stories to bring the data to life, and the call to action that we really started with about empowering a new generation of donors. And certainly, you know, with us today are a whole 600 maybe leaders who are really equipped to deliver on all three of those. So thanks to you, a pleasure, and thanks to everybody who joined us in the chat. I hope if you're able, you'll stay for the after party, which is going to come next, which is a more informal discussion with our panelists.
Karen and Una, it was an absolute honor. I mean that, like,
Eric, you too. Thank you,
Kimberly. Amazing. Kim, thanks for setting the stage.
And thanks to Dr. Christine Lumlung for setting this up.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
And just for direction, do we stay here or are we being sent someplace else?
I don't know.
The networking, if you click on networking, which is what we had talked about. Here, hi, Christine.
Okay.
Yep, if you scroll right down just a little bit, you'll see the link. You guys were amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. Hi, Lydia. I guess so. What'd you say? Oh, my goodness. Brother Malwin. How you doing, man? Thanks. You look good, bro.